to introduce you my good friend Glenda Kruss from HSRC in South Africa. We are very happy to have her here with us today. She's joining late from Cape Town, but such is the way we do this now during the pandemic. Everybody joining from different parts of the world. So she was very kind to accept our invitation. And this session is based on a very fruitful and long collaboration between several researchers in different universities across the globe, which has been going on for a long time. I'm not going to be very specific, not to give away my age. But more recently, the opportunity for us to have a meeting at Cedeplar, at the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais in Brazil, with several of our colleagues, with the general theme of catching up, and especially middle income traps. And from that meeting, we have several presenters and panelists. We developed an idea, a special issue in the Nova Economia journal, which is the academic journal from the Department of Economics from Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. And we have been working very hard on this special issue with all the troubles from the last, 18 months or so. And finally, last month, we managed to publish the online. I think it's very successful. It has several interesting papers, and I invite you all to check it out online. We have, as our international contributors came to find out, we have a very special way to publish these things online. In Brazil, we have at least 3 websites, one from Cielo, one from the journal system, and the third one, which is our portal, in which we present all the papers together with a select of artwork from different artists. We have been doing this in Nova Economia since 2003 to 2004. So the portal is, I consider it to be beautiful, but I'm biased. You can see the entire issue there before, until we finally print it. We still print our issues. So part of this work we have been carrying out for a very long time on catching up from the global south, from developing countries, and developing countries from the north as well. We have been collaborating on the issues of, especially on middle income traps, and we finally invited, the organizers finally invited Glenda to join this conference to talk a little bit about the special issue, about her own work. And then later on, I can talk a little bit more about Nova Economia journal. We have a special call for papers from this conference. We are going to select papers which have been presented in this conference, and I'll talk a little bit more about it after Glenda. So without further ado, welcome, Glenda. It's so nice to see you. I very much hope we can do this in person very soon. But in the meantime, we can use all the technology to be together again and to listen to you. So I'll pass the word for you, and you can give your presentation. Thank you very much. Thank everybody for joining us in this session. Once Glenda has given her talk, we can open for questions, and I'll talk a little bit more about our special issue. Thank you. Glenda, please.
Thank you very much, Gustavo, and thank you for the opportunity. I must stress that I'm speaking on behalf, as Gustavo says, of my colleagues and my collaborators over many years. And I'm coming here tonight to present our shared work. Let me get up the presentation. and let me start. So our topic tonight is development, lock-ins, traps, and catch-ups. And what we're trying to look at is what can we learn from this research, which we have been doing over a number of years, and which particularly the workshop that we held in Minas Gerais, and also a previous workshop in Korea, which was published in the Seoul Journal of Economics. What can we learn from this joint work that we've been doing over a number of years for how we break middle income traps in a post-COVID world? And the starting point is that when the pandemic broke out, the initial response for many countries was, well, for globally, the initial response was a politically induced recession in each country in order to avoid a public health catastrophe. And our concern is, how does this, and we know we're seeing more and more as time goes by, the differential impact of COVID on countries, and not all countries are equal. And our concern, and what I would be talking about tonight, is to reflect on how this impacts on countries that already have stalled development trajectories and that are already experiencing lock-ins that constrain their development when we look at them relative to the leading economies. And although our work was conducted pre-COVID, and as we were finalizing the work, COVID broke out, we began to reflect on what insights our work could bring to the challenges as we're trying to respond to the challenges of COVID and ensure that our countries don't fall even further behind. So what are we talking about when we're framing it in terms of middle income traps and lock-ins and stalled trajectories? So if we look at the histories of our economic development in middle income countries, we see that we have a series of cycles where we are managed to catch up for a while, but then we fall behind relative to the technological frontier, to the technologically dynamic center. And when we look at each country, we find that there's a wide range of sequences of these cycles of catching up and falling behind, and processes that are limited and limiting. And the question we're asking and really tackling in the special issue is, why are these surges and phases to reduce the gaps to the technologically dynamic center limited, and why don't they persist? Why don't we manage to keep on a cycle of catching up? And then the big question is, when we have the challenges of COVID, how does this enhance or reduce the possibilities of escaping the trap? So our question becomes even more pertinent in a context of a COVID world. And we're drawing insights from the patterns of 9 countries. In Asia, we look at India, China, Malaysia, Thailand, and South Korea. In Latin America, we look at Brazil and Mexico. And then in Africa, we look at South Africa. And lastly, Turkey is a key middle income country, but it sits uniquely in Europe and between Europe and Asia. And I'm not going to talk about Turkey too much tonight. So firstly, what I'm going to do, I'm first going to trace the trajectories of development over extended periods of time of our 9 countries. And then I'm going to look at how we analyze patterns within groups of countries as they experience these trajectories to trace and explain how and why they attempt to break lock-ins and escape the traps. And then lastly, we will raise questions how this analysis allows us to think about the COVID challenges a bit more creatively. So what you see is a map of the trajectories of the ratio of GDP per capita in each of our 9 countries to the center represented by the USA, GDP per capita in the USA. And we're tracking this over time from 1870 in this graph to 2008. And interestingly, what we find is that the ratio of GDP per capita in each country to the USA over time since 1870, the mean gap across all these 9 countries has stayed basically the same. It's very similar in 1870 to how it is in 2008, and there's no significant change. But what you can see in this diagram is that there's a similar trajectory for all the countries initially, and we're seeing in the early phases between 1870 and 1930, some are falling behind the US. And this persists until about the 1950s, until this sort of period. And then we start to see a growing heterogeneity from the 1950s onwards. The pink country is Korea, and you can see that that stands out amongst all the rest. And Korea is the only one of our 9 countries that has successfully transitioned from middle to high income status. Oh, sorry. But you can see that the heterogeneity and the trajectories of each country particularly after 1990 differs. So some are going up, some are going down, etc. So there's growing heterogeneity, especially from the 1990s onwards. So let's look at that period a little bit with a finer lens. So this graph shows you the period from 1990 to 2019. And here you can now begin to see 2 distinctive trajectories. The first is a set of countries that are reducing their gap to the USA, and those have an upward trajectory. So you can see Korea again, but you can see India is reducing the gap with the US. South Korea and China is the yellow is China and India is the green. So although India's graph is quite low, it is on a upward trajectory, reducing the gap. And if we calculate the extent to which this group of countries are reducing the gap, it's by more than double between 1990 and 2019. And a second group of countries are reducing the gap, but less than double, and that is Malaysia, which is this one with a maroon, Thailand, the blue, the light blue, and Turkey, the other light, the darker blue. But then we see a second set of trajectories of countries where the gap is actually widening. And here we find Brazil with a decline, South Africa again going downward, and Mexico, which is slight declining at a slightly lower rate than South Africa and Brazil. So there the gap is widening over the last decades as opposed to reducing the gap to the technology frontier. So the question is, how do we understand the patterns and the dynamics and the conditions that can explain the difference between these 2 sets of trajectories in each of the countries? And that is where the papers in the special issue come in. And we also draw on the papers in the Seoul Journal of Economics. And to understand the different trajectories, we first look at the sets of countries that are reducing the gap. And we look, most of them are in a middle income stage, except South Korea is already transitioned to high income, as I said, and India is transitioning to middle income. And we look at their trajectories. So, for example, Malaysia is analyzed as having a growth trajectory and being on the cusp of breaking the trap. And so the challenge in Malaysia is, pre-COVID, how do they capitalize on that upward trajectory and break the trap? And some of the challenges that the analysis points to in Malaysia is the need to improve education and institutions and institute vertical policy measures in order to be able to make that leap. And so just to highlight a couple of important dimensions that some of these country cases suggest that we should be looking at, and I'm really touching on dynamics that stand out here. For example, to take the Malaysia case again, one of the important points that the Malaysia case illustrates is that resource sectors such as palm oil and so on can actually be engines of export growth where there is high value add production and beneficiation prior to export rather than raw materials export. And if we look at the case of China, we're seeing a much more resilient catch-up path, but the challenge there is to preserve the catch-up trajectory and find a new geopolitical accommodation, because China illustrates the benefits of market sizes for economy of scale and scope in being able to break the middle income trap. And they show some very important dimensions, such as not only entering global value chains, but building strong internal technological capacity, but also the strategy that they've adopted of technological learning through mergers and acquisitions and through forward engineering and not only reverse engineering. But China, because of its size and its growing role geopolitically, it might be reaching the limits of its development, and that becomes a challenge for China. So in this way, while looking at these different cases, we can get insights for other countries from positive examples to be able to lessen the gap. And the challenge for these countries is sustaining the decrease of the gap and persist in upward cycles. But then when we look at the second set of trajectories, the countries that are regressing, that were growing and catching up from the 1950s, but then from the 1990s began to decrease their gap to the leading economies. We can get different kinds of insights from how we can understand why they are regressing and how to break these lock-ins and how to once again break what Albuquerque calls a set of vicious cycles where we begin to grow and then we get knocked back into a vicious cycle. And some of the examples here that we can draw insights, if we look at the case of Mexico, in contrast to China or Malaysia, in Mexico, we see that there was the adoption of a strategy of entering global value chains, and there was global value chain-led development. But this couldn't be sustained over time because there hadn't been a sufficient internal technological capacity building and upgrading. So the challenge proposed in Mexico is the need to promote domestic innovation capabilities. And when we come to the case of Brazil and South Africa, we also highlight a very critical dimension that is not typically been raised previously in the catch-up literature, and which Eduardo Albuquerque began to stimulate the analysis. And that is the impact of inequality as a cause and a consequence of lock-ins to vicious cycles. So if we take the example of South Africa, we're seeing that from the 1990s onwards, we have economic issues like deindustrialization, a growing financialization of the economy, where South Africa becomes almost in effect an investment home for global finance, but this is not being translated into local technological capacity building and upgrading. And we find the constraints of skills and leading to skills mismatches that lead to greater unemployment. And this is where inequality is becoming a cause and consequence of lock-in. And another critical dimension is the conditions of predatory innovation and growing corruption, and where elites capture particular economic processes, and that puts constraints on productive development. So in the case of South Africa, the analysis that I personally made in my paper is looking at how do we break this cycle, these vicious cycles, and looking at how we need political solutions and policy solutions, because the irony is, unlike in the 50s or even in the earlier 90s, the kinds of solutions that we require to break lock-in are very institution intensive, and they need strong institutions and they need strong, what we call upgrading coalitions. So we need to bring together fragmented social and economic groups and competing interests. And we need to harness actors across the national system of innovation to actively create the institutional conditions to break the lock-ins. And this idea of formation of upgrading coalitions provides some important clues if we want to think about breaking the lock-in around COVID. So let me now come back to the issue of COVID as a new challenge for an old trap. So if we look since March last year, we look at GDP as a very rough indicator, we find that most of the countries in our group sets are falling behind, and the gap to break out of the middle income trap is increasing. Now, the exceptions are China, Turkey, and South Korea. And there, some of the explanations is that those countries, particularly China and South Korea, already had previous experiences with viruses such as SARS. So they had begun to develop the systemic capacity to handle similar situations. And also those countries have a much stronger and much more widely diffused digitalization of their economies. And this facilitated the shifts to remote working and learning, unlike in our situations in South Africa and Brazil, for example. So to return to the issue of institutional building and policy solutions and building upgrading coalitions, the evidence that we are able to gather since March last year suggests that where there was long-term institutional building in health-related research, and in most of our countries, we find that one of their leading fields of research is health-related research. This may help to block a further decline and facilitate effective handling of the pandemic. So, for example, if there's a strong health-related research in South Africa, it's a kind of island of excellence where researchers are well able to sequence genomes and contribute to global sequencing of COVID viruses, far beyond the capacity of the country as a whole. And this can make be an important lever for preventing the growth in the gap and increasing the gap. And then if we look at the issue of vaccinations, the scope and speed of vaccination in a country increasingly over the last few months, we're seeing this can become a key defining feature in either narrowing the gap and enabling catch-up, or widening the gap and stimulating further falling behind or further stalled development trajectories. And this needs to be is related to multiple levels. So it's the manufacturing capacity, the commercial capacity, and the health resources and capacity for vaccination, and not only vaccination, for the other important health interventions in relation to COVID in terms of oxygen, ventilators, and so on. So the conditions within a country in terms of health-related research and the capacity in health-related research could be making a difference in the degree or the extent of falling behind or continuing in an upward trajectory. But we also want to relate to a broader global question, which is not related to what happens inside each country, but that COVID represents an opportunity for reorienting the direction of technological progress globally. And we're seeing a hint to that in the recent announcement by the US that it would support relaxation of requirements around IP requirements around vaccine production. So if the appropriate institutional architecture is put in place within a workable South-South and North-South cooperation framework, we might be able to, COVID might be able to be an opportunity to build the persistence of catch-up cycles in individual countries. And some of the questions that we need to then ask and grapple with as a country is how much manufacturing capacity for strategic assets should we build and should we be focusing our efforts into in the short, medium, and long term. And then another critical question is how can we balance investment in health-related industries, which is vital, but equally vital are the processes to build health institutions and health infrastructure that will reach the whole population. So the questions of inequality and equality as drivers, as cause and consequence of falling behind becomes vital and amplified during the period of COVID. And so it creates a space for us to begin to think about how we can do a combined formation of innovation systems around health and the welfare systems around health that are key to overcoming the middle income traps. So these are some of the questions that I'm opening for debate. And lastly, I'm sure Gustavo will speak more to it, but if you want to consult the special issue, volume 30, 2020, and here is the link to it. And thank you very much, everyone, for the opportunity to share some of this work.
Thank you, Glenda, for your talk, for your brevity. I think you managed to synthesize a lot of information in the time you're giving. I think of course, I have comments and questions of my own. I'll try not to monopolize the rest of the time. What I'm going to propose, if we have attendees in this room, which have joined through Zoom, which can ask questions in the chat. And we also have, as of now, around 100 people watching on YouTube. And if you feel inclined, you can post a question on the comment section, and I'll try to accommodate the questions and put the questions here to Glenda if we still have time. I think we have an initial question, of course, from Eduardo. Of course, would be the first. I think it's kind of a personal catch-up initiative. I have questions of my own. I will try to, maybe we can have groups of 3 questions, and we'll see how we can go on from there. And later on, I can talk about the special issue. The first question from Eduardo then, he asks if Glenda could please explore how similar South Africa and Brazil are in our traps in terms of inequality, structural heterogeneity, islands of excellence, and the like. So this is the question from Eduardo. I don't know if you have another one. If anybody, if you want to post on the chat or in the comment section on YouTube, I have questions of my own. I'll put one for you, Glenda. It's very difficult to talk about these issues. I don't know how you felt about preparing for this session, not only because of the time difference and everything else that's going on in everybody's lives. But I think it's particularly hard to think about middle income traps for these countries in a time like this, when COVID is absolutely ravaging India and Brazil in particular. Of course, the situation is pretty dire in South Africa and in other countries. which are part of this, our research network, especially in Brazil, in India, maybe because of the size, because of the numbers, the sheer numbers in the last few months. It's pretty hard to talk about national innovation systems and R&D and collaboration between firms and universities and all the different issues that this research network has touched upon, and which the articles, the papers also address. And in particular, I think, and this is my question for you, how much of an example of a trap, of the type of trap that really is going on in many of these countries? Because maybe with all the horrors of the pandemic, there is a quote unquote good opportunity here when we talk about a type of investment, a type of bet on technology and on public policies, which in the case of a pandemic have characteristics which have been solved. In particular, we know there is demand. There is local demand, there is international demand. There are no shortage of dollars to pay for many goods related to the pandemic, which hospitals are demanding in every single place, even in countries which are faring better. But in particular, in terms of vaccines, some of which are very innovative, and others are relying upon old technology or previous research from the last maybe decade, 2 decades. And still, India hasn't been able to cope with the pandemic, even producing a lot of vaccines for the rest of the world. It wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to combine this capacity with other institutions, with other political factors. And in particular in Brazil, if there is a worst example of a trap, we have failed in every single possible way we look at it. So we have a failure of institutions, of public policies, of many of the good sides of globalization up to now that many companies and universities and research centers have been relying upon. And we're locked in into this pandemic until all the countries have supplies to offer us. And I went with one example and I was thinking when you were giving your speech, your talk, in terms of how easy of a bet for the public sector or for the private sector investing in some initiative would be. In the case of Brazil, I think is a case of a unstoppable force, which is COVID and the new variants and the way this thing is passing on inside our cities and our country, our institutions, our system in general. Because we were in a situation in which we have a viable vaccine in our university developed in-house, which required to go through the first phase of tests, $30 million, which with our current exchange rate, it's really nothing in dollars. And the mayor had to put on the money. Not a single company. The largest construction company from our state, which pays for all the players from my beloved Clube Atlético Mineiro, paid a lot more last year for football players than for a phase 1 trial with guaranteed demand in case it is successful. No company, not a single one from pharmaceutical side or from mining, from any single sector in Minas Gerais or in Brazil at large came forth to invest in a easy, cheap in-house possibility. So how do you see this trap, considering this guaranteed opportunity for the private and public sector? That's the second question. That's the easy one. I'll put this two for you, the Eduardo questions, and then I will try to write down the other ones from the chat and from the YouTube comment section. Thank you, Glenda.
Okay, well, you're not giving me a very easy, you're asking me to solve the problems of the world here. But I'm going to take a bit of a step back and just start with Eduardo's question. If you want to look at how similar South Africa and Brazil are in our traps in terms of inequality, structural heterogeneity, and islands of excellence. And that begins to address some of the questions that you're asking. So if we look at some of the vicious cycles in the Brazilian case that we found equally present in the South African case. So this is now under normal conditions pre-COVID. You find limitations on the growth of domestic markets and the size of consumer markets in both our countries. We're finding that we're locked into the natural resources and we don't have sufficient beneficiation and industries behind the technology frontier. And in the South African case, I explained this issue of the financialization of the economy and the growth in services and the decline in manufacturing and the growing mismatch of people, jobs that require certain high-level skills, but there aren't sufficient people who are educated and trained to be able to fill those positions. And I believe that that has similar dynamics in Brazil. And then the difficulty about predatory innovation dynamics, which are not investing in productive investment and innovative economic dynamics. And then these series, very importantly, and I think often when we looking at the issues of middle income traps, we are focusing on the economics and we are not foregrounding the politics sufficiently. So the political tensions and crises provoke stalemates that block periods of limited catch-up. And I'm not going to speak for Brazil, but for South Africa, we find we emerging from a period of what we call state capture, where we had almost 10 years where large-scale public investment, instead of being put into infrastructure and productive investment, was being, in a word, stolen into for private gain, whether into private companies or politically connected elites and so on. And we're finding this is going pervasive throughout the economy. So we've had it in relation to state-owned enterprises, but equally it happens in local government and provincial governments where funding that should be going into health infrastructure or water and sanitation is being siphoned off into these predatory corrupt practices. So in that case, those create lock-ins that make it very difficult to break out those political dynamics and those predatory economic and innovation processes. And what I understand in Brazil, you have very similar dynamics operating. But where we find the possibilities for the future, and sometimes when I talk about the possibilities for the future, I do have a sense, am I being too idealistic and too unrealistic? But we know that we can have these, we do have these islands of excellence where we do have R&D strengths, innovation strengths, scientific strengths. And we do have the capacity in our countries, and I've studied cases in South Africa, and I know there are cases in Brazil. And in Brazil, I think health innovation has been one of those islands of excellence, where you can bring together competing interests. So we have an example that I've looked at around a large-scale big science astronomy project, where you've been able to organize private sector investment. You've organized public investment into higher education in the forms of bursaries and research funding in various fields that need to be aligned for this big science project. You've had a public investment into technical and vocational education that's required for the implementation of the infrastructure. So it is possible to create these upgrading coalitions, and they require the political will. They require the public and private investment. They require the education and skills, etc. All those institutions that we know are so vital to breaking these traps. So I think when it comes to the kinds of questions you are asking about the health, that is where, and as you say, so if one had to become an activist in this situation, your activism is around pushing for upgrading coalitions around health innovation and investment in health manufacturing and health production, of the example that you mentioned. So if we look at our immature systems of innovation, they are missing key networks, they're missing key institutions, they're missing key actors. And so that's what's happening in the case you've described, where you've got the scientific production in the university, but it's locked into the university because you can't get private sector investment. And that's where I think you have the gap of political will. So if you had stronger political will from the center, that would be motivating and driving privates and encouraging and promoting private sector investment into that kind of project that you've explained. And if we look what's been going on in South Africa, we've had some successes and some failures. So we have some successes where our Department of Science and Innovation is driving and pushing and pulling in big companies to pivot their production to start producing ventilators, for example. The oxygen production that is the biggest gap in India at the moment is another case in point. And if you look at what I've read about India, I haven't studied it, but if you look at the critiques, there's also a critique that there's a failure of central government push into meeting these needs for stronger oxygen production. So I think that in our innovation work, it's not that we can't talk about innovation and R&D, because they're more vital than ever. We can't get forward unless even if they change the TRIPS laws and they said to Brazil and South Africa, you can start producing vaccines tomorrow. We've got to have the capacity, the scientific capacity to do that. We have to have the institutional capacity to do that. And we've got to have it across entire value chains. So it's not only about the science, it's about the innovation across the entire value chain. So for example, you talking about a gap in not having funding for testing, but equally you might not have the local capacity for the testing labs and the sterile labs that you need for testing. So it's pushing us to invest far more in R&D capacity and innovation capacity. And I think it's vital. If we don't do that, we are definitely going to fall right behind. And that's a question of our very survival. And I've got myself stuck here. And you talked about, we locked into the pandemic until we get supplies from other countries. Yes, we are. And that's where we need new kinds of upgrading coalitions globally. And the World Health Organization is playing a key role in trying to push some of those global cooperation movements like the COVAX, like the push for opening up IP rights for extend manufacturing of vaccines. So I think we do, and this pandemic does give us an opportunity to shift those massive global inequalities in favor of the people of our countries. And I think that is what is incumbent upon us to be pushing. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I wasn't looking for answers, but for your comments on these issues. Of course, there are no easy answers for this. I think one of the points you make, which are key for these upgrading coalitions, is it's linked with a very old problem in economics, which is coordination failures. There's nobody coordinating anything. And maybe we have like some sort of situation in which we have insular institutions, which in of themselves work quite well in normal times. Sometimes they will cooperate with each other, a brother or a home. But in this case, which is nothing, maybe the only thing that can be compared to the situation in the last year and a half, maybe it's a world war. There is no coordination, either international or national, considering all these countries. I was giving examples of course, developing countries, because those are the ones which we have been studying. But in other research initiatives, we study developed countries as well, and some of them part of the European Union, which only now they're starting to pull themselves up, pulling from their own shoelaces, without vaccines, without production capacity. So we are not alone in this, but maybe we are deeper into a trap, and we have no one coordinating these initiatives. We have to see, so we have very low-hanging fruit and no one to pick these fruits, which is very it's agonizing for us to see. I have a few questions from YouTube. Julio Cesar Morin asks if I'm guessing in the context of middle income traps and the COVID situation, if there's a different future for innovation, if there's maybe space for a new approach within economics. And Pedro Viana Duarte asks if what do you think about South cooperation, which I would have to correct, developing country cooperation. We have been listening about this for a long time, but not much has been going on lately. That's the second question. And I think the last one, again, from Eduardo, very briefly, if there's any coordination between South Africa and other countries in Africa. I guess that's the question. If there was a coordination, and if COVID is changing the status quo. And I think we can close with those questions, and then we can have final comments and from you and from me and the session. Thank you.
So I'll take the two questions are related. So let me start with the issue of is there a different future for innovation, and do we need a new approach in economics in the context of middle income traps in COVID? And I think my answer to this would be to push the agenda that has kind of been there in economics for quite some time, but is not to the mainstream. And that is the research that has been done increasingly about inequality and the growing inequality globally, and how growing inequality globally is a fetter on development globally, particularly for developing countries. So I think that the current situation creates a space for us to foreground those kinds of analyses and to be looking at the inequalities and the imbalances within countries and between countries, and to foreground that much more in our, I'm not an economist, I'm more of a sociologist, but I am familiar with evolutionary economics, which would foreground, is increasingly foregrounding inequality. But in our innovation studies, the issues around inequality are coming more and more to the fore and are becoming more central in our analyses. And I would promote that as a very fruitful way of moving forward, those kinds of investigations. In terms of South-South cooperation and the specific example of South Africa and other countries in Africa and how COVID changes that, I've kind of spoken to this a little bit, but I think South Africa plays quite a key role and has always in Africa through the African Union and the NEPAD initiatives. And our president, South Africa was most recently, our president was the president of the AU until recently, the African Union. And there is a lot of cooperation between South Africa and other African allies around COVID, around the provision, the sharing of expertise and the sharing of vaccines and so on. So I think there is more scope, there is a political commitment to it, how much there are the resources to be able to implement and actualize that. It's not something I've studied. I'm sure my colleagues in my organization, we have an African Institute, and I'm sure they are studying how much this is actually happening in practice. But again, as I've already said, I think this, Gustavo drew the example that the closest analogy to what we're experiencing is a world war. And if you think of the post-war period, that most of the multilateral institutions we have now emerged after 1945 as solutions to prevent that war happening again. And I've read some analyses recently that have questioned that some of those institutions, they have their origins in that post-war set of problems and solutions, and that it's actually time for us to rethink some of our global multilateral institutions and create new ones that can be appropriate to the kinds of cooperation that we need to face this COVID challenge. And there's kind of lip service, I'm sure you have it in Brazil, in South Africa, we hear it a lot, that no country can defeat COVID on its own, and we all interdependent, and COVID highlights the interdependence in the world and how much we depend on one another, and that you can't resolve this as a national problem. So I think, again, that is a space for pushing boundaries and for pushing new kinds of multilateral organizations. And I think in the world that we live with the digital tools and the digitalization of the world we have, that there's space to actually push and grow virtual networks and networks around addressing COVID. And I think that's something that our research needs to explore and push, what the opportunities are for growing cooperative networks and collaborative networks.
Okay, thank you, Glenda. Thank you so much for joining us, for accepting the invitation from the organizers. I have two very brief reminders. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me as well. Inviting Glenda and opening this space for us to talk about the special issue and about our research. It's not easy to organize a conference, and I cannot imagine organizing a conference in a situation like this. So well done. Thank you so much. Eduardo asked me to remind everybody that related to the issues we have been talking here, tomorrow we have a book launch from Kun Lee, titled China, Technological Leapfrogging and Economic Catch-Up. This is a very interesting, I invite everybody to join. It's going to be 8 p.m. Brazilian time, and that's because it's going to be 8 Seoul time in South Korea. So everybody else around the globe will have to adjust to their own time. So it's just very interesting in itself, 12 hours apart. So it's very much related to the topics we have been discussing here. And finally, I would like to remind everybody joining either through Zoom or through YouTube who have submitted and have their papers accepted for this conference. There's a call for papers from Nova Economia. There's still time to submit the papers for evaluation. All the instructions are on the Nova Economia website. You can just type Nova Economia Journal or Revista Nova Economia on Google, and you have access to the website. And we hope to have many submissions, and we have a special editor and team to go through the papers and hopefully have a very good selection. And we can have another very good special issue, such as the one we have just been talking about. Thank you very much, everybody on the Zoom room here and on YouTube, and especially to Glenda for joining us and spending this time, investing this time on knowledge and talking to us this evening in South Africa and this afternoon in Brazil. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.